Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lucy Razzle, and I work in the research department at the National Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the first event in our new methodologies series, Knitting the Spare Rib Women's Woolly, Making and Remaking the Archive, with independent researcher Becky Male. In this series, we're bringing together researchers and practitioners, each of whom in different ways engages creatively with archives and archival materials. Throughout this programme, we're also encouraging you, the audience, to engage with our collections in new and innovative ways, to explore the possibilities for creative collaborations, and to consider methodologies and practices that reach beyond traditional academic practice and outputs. I have a few housekeeping notes before we get started. The session is about 1 hour long, finishing at around 2 p.m. UK time. And Becky's presentation will be followed by the opportunity to ask questions. The event is being run through Zoom webinar, which means you can ask questions by submitting them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Do submit any questions at any point throughout the talk, and we'll come back to them during the Q&A session. My colleagues, the National Archives admin team, will be sharing some guidance regarding the Q&A function in the chat. Should you need any technical support during the event, please reach out to us via the chat and they can assist you. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube in due course. We've also enabled live captions. You can access these at the bottom of your screen by clicking Live Transcript, Show Subtitle, or alternatively, you can hide these if you find them distracting by following the same process. So today we're delighted to be joined by Becky Male, who will be reflecting on how her creative response to the archive drew out some of the complex histories of feminism, fashion, capitalism, and creativity implicated in a knitting pattern and its afterlives. Her work illustrates the valuable insights that volunteers in particular can bring to archives and collections. In 1982, the feminist magazine Spare Rib published a knitting pattern for a woman's woolly. This was the last knitting pattern published by the magazine. After a copy of the pattern was recently donated to Glasgow Women's Library, Becky embarked on a project to knit not only this jumper, but also her own version, an intersectional jumper, reflecting the cultural, social, and economic changes since the original Spare Rib pattern was published. Becky is an independent researcher who has volunteered with Glasgow Women's Library for over 5 years, focusing on knitting patterns and their place in women's histories. She has given several talks on the topic, including Life on and off the needle in the 20th century, about Glasgow Women's Library's patterns, and women's countercultural creativity in conjunction with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. This weekend, she presented her first paper at the Making Historical Dress Conference at De Montfort University in Leicester. So, Becky, over to you.
Thank you very much. All right, I will pull up my presentation. Fabulous. Okay, so yes, so like Lucy said, I've been a volunteer at Glasgow Women's Library for the last 5.5 years, and I have mostly worked on the knitting patterns, but I also do a whole bunch of other things around the place. I'm an independent researcher, but I also really like the term para-academic. Someone who's engaged with and in academic research, but out with traditional academic institutions. Before I go any further, I do want to stress that I'm not talking on behalf of Glasgow Women's Library today. This is my own research. I'm very like to say I, we, my, we, and our when talking about Glasgow Women's Library, but this is more habit than anything else. I'm not specifically speaking on behalf of the library. I'm also aware that I talk quite fast. So if anyone is having a problem with the captioning not catching how fast I'm talking, please let the chat know, and I will endeavour to slow down. And I'm going to endeavour as well to describe some of the images I have on screen for anybody who might be struggling to see them. So, a little bit about Glasgow Women's Library. Glasgow Women's Library was founded in 1991 as a response, in many ways, to Glasgow being named European City of Culture in 1990. A lot of the artists and activists on the ground noticed that the focus of the programme was very much on male artists and male culture in Scotland, and not really on anything to do with women. So it began very much as a grassroots project. And because of that, volunteering has always been at the heart of the place and has been an important part of how the library operates. It's the only accredited museum in the UK dedicated to women's history and lives, and the museum collection is recognised as nationally significant collection by the Scottish Government. All of the books and objects are donated. There is no acquisitions budget. So if anybody is publishing a book that's by or about women and wants to send a copy, just saying. But as a result of that, the collection is very eclectic because it reflects parts of women's lives that the donors themselves thought were worth preserving. And included in that is the vast array of knitting patterns. In 2013, we moved into the former Carnegie Library in Bridgeton, which you can see here on the right. It's an absolutely gorgeous building in the East End of Glasgow. And it has modern climate controlled archives for all of the things that are accessioned into the archives. Although I have to say we are starting to outgrow that. So who knows where we're going to put them all now. And we welcome researchers from all over the world. There's around, I think, about 80 volunteers engaged in the Women's Library at any one time. So we are very integral to how the library works. And we're engaged in a range of roles from, writing blog posts about events, cataloguing, shelving books, front of house, welcoming people, English as a second language, and adult literacy and numeracy tutors. Some of those are volunteers. And then there's people like me who get a bit stuck into everything. There's a range of events throughout the year. And so if you're up that way at any point, come visit. And many of the events are still hybrid as well to increase accessibility. One of the objects that we've had an awful lot donated are copies of the feminist magazine Spare Rib, to the point that we're having to turn them down and sell them away. When I tell you we literally have boxes of these things in the basement, I'm not kidding. We have so many, and there's only so many we can store. It was founded in 1972, and it attempted to be a women's magazine that embraced women's liberation. It sold on shelves in newsagents and was ad-supported just like other women's magazines. But finding what its identity as a women's magazine was going to be took a little while. So on the left here is a cover for one of the issues. I just really like this one. Bright yellow with this woman raising her foot, kicking at the viewer. I think it's to do with self-defense. It's just a really good cover. The second issue they published, they offered this knitting pattern, which is very similar to other women's magazines of the period. A lot of them, like knitting patterns, were a crucial part of women's magazines in this period. This was specifically made for Spare Rib, and then styled with accessories and clothing by Biba, the fashion brand. It is worth saying, though, that this took the founders a bit aback. They were not expecting quite as many people to want to order patterns for this. And they never ran anything like this again. I think something, again, with this tension that I'm going to come onto in a minute, felt not quite right for them about this. But in building that identity as a women's magazine, they were faced with the complexities of making in the early 70s. So there's this movement of anti-capitalist self-sufficiency, but at the same time, second wave feminism was attempting to liberate women from domesticity. So there's this conflict between the two things. One way they grappled with this was their spare parts feature, which is on the left here. And it taught women how to do things out with the usual skill set provided by women's magazines. This one on the left is to do with how you decorate your home. So it's preparing the surface for the walls, putting stencils up, putting up wall coverings like what fabric and wallpaper. So definitely different to traditional women's magazines. At the same time, in the same issue, you've got this simpler than simplicity feature, which attempts to teach people how to make a very simple skirt. Simplicity, by the way, being one of the big pattern brands that's still around today. And it's a beginner's sewing project. The founders themselves have said that they didn't necessarily get the balance right between liberation from domesticity and these tasks that actually form a foundational part of how we live. Specifically, they were talking about food and cooking, but I'd argue craft as well was also encompassed in that. And there was almost, I'd argue there was an overcorrection in how much they tried to eliminate craft from later issues, because the spare parts feature only lasted until 1974. So only for 2 years and only in 25 issues. Credit, by the way, on the research into craft in spare rib has to go to Dr. Alison Main, who wrote a fantastic article on this. But in 1982, they published their last piece on knitting, the pattern for the woman's woolly. When I first joined GWL, it was suggested that I might like to knit something for the archive. I think it was the very first conversation I had with the curator. But for me, if I was going to knit something to go in there, it needed to be purposeful. It needed to say something. I didn't want to knit something just because it was, attractive and I found it, enticing. I wanted it to have a real meaning. And for me, this was that pattern, and that became the Woman's Woolly project. So this project had two creative strands to it taking place simultaneously. One is the making and the other is the writing. And both are creative responses in their own right. And I would argue that it have been as equally important. A recreation of the jumper to go into the archive and to be knitted as close as possible to the written pattern using contemporaneous techniques sourced from books and manuals of the period. And then the follow-up to that was to make a jumper for me using my preferred techniques and updated to reflect trends in modern yarns and modern feminism. But at the same time, I was writing the blog posts. Now, I will be honest, when I started the blog posts, I thought it was going to be like one little post about, what I did and how I did it. And yeah, it didn't become that. It ended up turning into 4 blog posts, which came into about 7,000 words. So way more than I intended to write. As a result of that, I also recorded it and edited it into a podcast, which came to about 45 minutes, because I'm aware that not everyone's got time to sit and read for that long. But maybe putting it on for 45 minutes as a podcast is something you can do. The QR code in the top corner and the URL at the bottom go to the same place. If you miss them, I'll have them back up later. The idea, though, was to be as close as possible to the original. For me, this isn't just a jumper, right? It's a physical representation of the language of knitting, a way to interpret it for non-knitters. The way I thought about it is it's not from 1982, but it is of 1982. And that was an important distinction. I'll come back to some of the technical choices in a minute, but the first thing I want to do is draw your attention to the colour and the yarn choices. So these colours, the navy, the burgundy, and the grey, are the ones given in the original pattern. Now, you see there's this burgundy band around the edge of the Venus symbols. That's invisible on the pattern. Like, you cannot see it. It's barely visible. So finding that as I knitted it was a really exciting thing. I did make one mistake, though. So the tension given for the jumper is an Aran weight tension, but the yarn specifies double knit. Now, knitters in the audience will probably be like a slight intake of breath there. I misread that and chose Aran weight yarn. So what that means is it's about 25% thicker than the original pattern. The sizing hasn't changed, thankfully, but what it does change is the drape. This ended up a much denser, in some ways quite warmer jumper than the original was intended to be. The reason I didn't undo that mistake and start again was very simple. If I, with 20 years of experience knitting, made that mistake, then there's a very good chance that the knitters of the 1980s made exactly the same one. And that seemed like a reasonable mistake to leave in my piece. I did also choose pure wool because that was given in the original as the specified yarn. Slightly unusual because in this period there is a very much Bry nylon, acrylics, like these are very popular yarns. So there is something unusual about specifying pure wool. Not sure why, but I went with it. The blog posts really started to grow when I began to look slightly deeper into the pattern itself. Unfortunately, the designer used a pseudonym, and I haven't been able to find that pseudonym anywhere else. She doesn't appear to have used it anywhere else. But the point at which this broke open was when I looked into the photographer. Now, if you're familiar with the work of photographer Jill Posner, it's probably this image. I love this. So this is a Fiat billboard from 1979. And the billboard says, if it were a lady, it would get its bottom pinched. And then underneath, graffiti the words, if this lady was a car, she'd run you down. I love that. It's so good. This piece was actually recently shown in Tate in their Women in Revolt exhibition as part of feminist art in the 70s and 80s. Really good exhibition, really enjoyed it. But this piece also appeared in her book, Spray It Loud, on political graffiti. I didn't realize until I posted this that the two that I selected as examples are both quite violent, because the cover has this billboard that says, renew his interest in carpentry, and then underneath graffiti it says, saw his head off. Yeah. They're not all violent, I must say, and there is a range of different political graffiti in the book. But the pattern was released in January of 1982. Later in 1982, Posner releases this book. One of the things I learned from the exhibition, actually, is that she and her friends would go and graffiti pieces of advertising that they thought were particularly sexist. So then I'm going to show you this image. And this is the image that accompanies the spare rib jumper. So obviously she was working on the book at the point at which she took these photos, and they very much influenced this, because here you have the model wearing the jumper, crouched in front of a brick wall, and on the brick wall are the words, if I gave her the wool, would she make me one too? Now, for those of you that don't know, this is the punchline to a very old joke, which goes, the setup goes, my mother made me a homosexual. Yeah, okay. So there's a subtle queerness already there in these images just from that on the wall, right? You have to know that joke in order to find it funny and in order to connect with it. And I decided to implement some of that subtle queerness into the second jumper. There's other things as well to analyze about this. So the model's short hair, minimal makeup and jewelry, the simple white shirt, unisex jeans. These are, I'd argue, what Betty Luther Hillman identified as the uniform of lesbian feminists of this period. The shirt and jeans are, by this time, so ubiquitous that they're almost invisible. Jeans, likely Levi's or Wranglers, boot cut and non-stretch. And then the likely shoes here are going to be trainers or boots, practical, comfortable, and not explicitly feminine. They rejected femininity and fashion in order to be, quote unquote, ugly, and therefore free of the pressures of male desire. Now, unfortunately for them, that isn't really how fashion works. Fashion, whatever you do with it, communicates something to somebody. So they created this anti-fashion, but at the same time, it became its own fashion. And there's various accounts of women in this period in the lesbian feminist movement and on the margins of it, who found themselves quite pressured to fall into this form of attempted genderless dressing, when actually that wasn't who they were and that wasn't how they wanted to be. For some, it was liberating, for some, it was oppressive. But either way, what this tells us is that there's more going on in this pattern than just the jumper. There's also the wider context in which it's taking place. Unfortunately, the actual jumper is a hell of a lot less subversive than it appears. With the exception of that band of Venuses, which, yeah, completely subversive. Anybody wearing that, you have no question about who she is. It's a fairly unremarkable pattern, and frankly, it could have come out of any pattern book of the period. It's knitted flat in pieces, and then it's seamed up, and then you pick up the neckline stitches afterwards. By the way, I absolutely loathe doing this. It was horrendous because you're basically knitting an oval in a straight line. Horrible, do not recommend. But there's a really interesting thread in knitting, pardon the pun, in knitting with construction. So hats, gloves, socks, they've always been knitted in the round. And so have many traditional jumpers, things like a lot of Scandinavian jumpers, the Ganzi. These have always been circular knitted as one full piece. But 20th century patterns that are produced by yarn companies are overwhelmingly knitted flat. The reason that I've come across this, and I'm inclined to agree with it, is that many of these people were trained in dressmaking. So they just applied that to knitting, which created these pieces. These patterns are incredibly prescriptive, and they don't encourage you to any deviation, be that because your body's different, be that because you're interested in taking parts of it and adapting it. And I'd argue that in some ways, the spare rib pattern actually does fall into that as well. It's different to the original spare parts features, and there's no teaching. There's nothing here that's going to teach you how to do things. It's written very, very sparsely and assumes that you have a level of knowledge as a knitter, which makes me think I'd almost argue that this is analogous to spare rib itself. Both are attempting to be radical in their respective contexts, one in publishing, the other in knitting. But they don't do anything to expand them and push the medium further. It's unfair to say that the radicalism is surface level, because that's not true, but there are aspects that they are not pushing and that they are conforming to whilst doing that radicalism. As I came to work on it, one of the things I realized that, due in part to the influence of the internet, I know a hell of a lot more about knitting than many knitters would have done 40 years ago. So because of that, I went back into the Women's Library archive to find some reference books. One of these is Golden Hands, originally published, I believe, in 1972, so the same year Spare Rib was. It was a part work that released installments on a whole range of different crafts and functioned essentially as a reference guide. So it would teach you a skill and then would teach you how to do that skill and give you a practical application for it. I tried to pick the most 70s pattern on the right here. The most 70s cover on the right here with this dress, and this woman, she's very 70s in her stylings. And then on the left here, there is the red binders. And frequently now when you come across Golden Hands, they are in one of these red folders. I haven't been able to find anything written about Golden Hands in the academic literature, which is a shame, because I know from going into archives, and I know from talking to women of the period and finding them in charity shops and online, they were everywhere. For many women who were learning to craft in this anti-capitalist early 1970s period, this was their reference guide. So yeah, I'd love to dig more into them if we, but at the moment it's not a lot written about. But I did go through them and double check my techniques, pick my cast on. And the other one I used was this book, Knitting Fashion, a step-by-step guide to knitting and crochet by Pam Davis, which was published to accompany a 1976 BBC series. And I found that the first episode is actually on the BBC's archive website. So yeah, it is very 70s as an instructional program, but it's a really good insight into the techniques available at the time. So I picked my techniques. This is the top chart I made to keep track of them. Some of these, frankly, are just my personal preference, and we don't need to get into why I prefer SK to slip one, K1 path slips over, right? That's really boring, intricate technical details that actually are mostly just personal preference. But I am going to highlight a few here. So I used a long tail cast on. When I went into the sources, of the ones that was given, that was the stretchiest. Wouldn't be the one I'd choose today, but it was the one that was there. Very rarely in modern patterns do I see backstitch given as a suggestion for seaming. Look, very rarely. I think the only time I see it these days is in how to sew in a zip. And then the other big change that I want to pull your attention to is press. So this pattern tells you to essentially iron your pieces, whereas the modern technique, which is actually a far older technique, is you get it wet and stretch it out. And that allows all the stitches to settle down to be even sizes. But yeah, so very interesting to me that these are the things it was suggesting I do. But where the jumper can be claimed to be radical is its pockets. Something wildly simple, but missing from so many women's clothes. To give you a very brief overview of pockets, women prior to the early 1800s would have what was called a tie-on pocket. So a kind of bag that went close to the body underneath the skirts, and you'd reach through the skirts in to get your pocket. If you think of those very slinky Jane Austen dresses of the Empire and the Regency periods, you couldn't really do that. Those dresses showed too much the figure, so they didn't hide your pockets. So there started to be this thing called the reticule, which is this tiny little handbag. And then following on from that, when the skirts got bigger again, the pocket never really came back. Which has left us with a very strange situation where actually the pockets for modern women are less practical than the ones of the women from the 18th century, which to me is slightly wild. As far as 20th and 21st century goes, their absence can be summarized by the additional cost and complexity to manufacturers, how ubiquitous the handbag became, and belief by many designers that, frankly, a bulging pocket is unflattering on women. In making this jumper, though, the knitter herself can choose to prioritize their own needs over an aesthetic ideal of a designer and become, in effect, their own designer by taking dominion over their own pockets and what goes in them, which probably, I think, makes this the most feminist part of the jumper, because pockets like this are so rare in women's knitwear from this period. So these pictures are just so that you can have a little better look at the Venus bands and the shoulder seam, and where the shoulder and the top of the sleeve seam interact. For all that I hate seaming, I have to say I think I did a very good job on those shoulder seams. But yeah, I mean, you can see that this is a very bright band of Venuses. You're not going to miss this. So with the archive jumper finished, I moved on to my jumper. The pattern actually gives two options. It gives you the sleeved and the sleeveless. It describes the sleeveless as a pullover. Couple of reasons I decided on the pullover. but one of them was I didn't want any more sleeves, and the other was actually I could do with a sleeveless jumper for my wardrobe, so I might as well. In the blog posts, I get very reflective about my own relationship with my body, with clothes, with colour. And in reading that back several months on, I realised that what I'm describing about my performance of gender and the way I use clothes fits into a concept known as lesbian camp. Now, a little bit about camp. It's almost impossible to define. It's one of its important factors. Susan Sontag, who wrote the seminal notes on camp, straight up says that. But good examples would be Dolly Parton is camp, right? Drag is camp. Someone like Joe Lycett, you could argue, is camp, right? That is the traditional gay male camp. It's an aesthetic, it's a mode of performance, and it's a way of relating to the world. And although it's usually ascribed to gay men, lesbian camp also exaggerates heteronormative depictions to the point of absurdity, as Nielsen phrases it, which, let's be honest, this shade of pink is absolutely absurd. But an important difference is that lesbian camp often requires a level of creation by the wearer rather than the reinterpretation that characterizes gay male camp. And it often has a traditional audience as well to gay male camp. So next I'm going to show you some of the examples that are given in the literature about lesbian camp. I'm going to do my best to try and explain why I think some of them are camp, but like I said, definition of camp is kind of part of its beauty. It's supposed to defy definition. So the first one I'm going to show you here is Dusty Springfield. So on the left we have from her first album in 1964, and on the right we have her, I believe it was a collection release in 2004, and I'm not sure of the date on the second photo. But the thing I want to draw you to is how she uses femininity and masculinity. She herself said that she aimed for a form of over-the-top femininity that wasn't a threat to people. She wanted to be as unsexy as possible, and in using that was using that femininity to try and make that so. So if you look at her from the neck up, especially in the image on the left, she's got this big bouffant hair, this heavy eye makeup. But from the neck down, it's a very plain blue denim button-through shirt. And I believe she's wearing jeans in this. Again, 1964, this is not a typical outfit for a female singer to be wearing. So already you've got these things overlapping, these things in juxtaposition with each other. And then the image on the right, she's lying on this floor, she's wearing a skirt, she's wearing, I think, kitten heels, tights or pantyhose, but she's wearing, again, a button-through shirt, but with white collars and cuffs, and the cuffs have, oh, I'm trying to remember the word for it, that's really frustrating. Anyway, cool. But it's very clearly there are aspects of masculinity to this. She was also a frequent attendee at the Gateway Club, which was the lesbian club in London. And the Gateway's Club had its own dress code known to its patrons. And that did not always require trousers in people who took a butch role. So the choice of skirt in the image on the left, to me, there is definitely that narrow skirt that's very common of the Gateways Club of this period. So this is what I mean about having an alternative audience. A certain audience knows how to read this and sees her as queer. A different audience sees this as the hyper femininity of the face and maybe doesn't connect that to the rest of what's happening on her body. The other name always given in the literature is K.D. Lang, the Canadian singer. So on the left here, we've got the Vanity Fair cover from 1993, where she is dressed in a suit and tie in a barber's chair, and she's being shaved by a semi-naked Cindy Crawford. I mean, this is, I mean, it's a great image. What can I say? She looks very happy. She's got this mustache of shaving foam, but there's definitely this playing with masculinity and femininity, and it's a performance. But on the right here, we have, this is actually the cover from her 2021 album. And obviously she no longer looks like this. It's 20 odd years later. This image actually was taken in 1995. And whilst it's a very feminine dress, it hugs her curves. The blue fabric is cupping her breasts from in the halter neck. I'd argue there's a subtle queer butchness. Again, this is very hard to define. This feels like lesbian camp to me, and trying to explain and define why is very difficult. But yes, so I feel that both of these are her playing with gender, exaggerating gender, and especially exaggerating femininity and heteronormative depictions to the point of absurdity. And again, a queer viewer will read these differently, often to a straight viewer. Now I'm going to add my third one to this pantheon of lesbian camp, and that's Kristen Stewart. So on the left, we have her Rolling Stone cover from this year, where she's dressed in a leather waistcoat, a jock strap with a hand, and this shag mullet. And on the right, this is her actually the look she wore to the Met Gala in 2021. And again, we've got these exaggerations of gender. We've got this very exaggerated pink frilly top, but with very tailored tuxedo trousers. And again, if you look at how she holds her body in this image, this isn't some sweet little feminine pose. This is comfortable, relaxed, queer to a viewer who knows it, whilst at the same time with these very exaggerated heteronormative gender aspects. Okay, so now I've told you all of that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I chose the materials I chose for the jumper. Because as well as reflecting my own relationship to gender and gender performativity, I wanted to reflect some of the changes in the commercial landscape of knitting. So I chose wool, like the original. There's a much greater desire for it now than there was at the time. But I should add that there is a conversation that needs to be had, and that hasn't been had, about cost, class, and access to natural fibres that, frankly, knitting spaces are doing a really bad job of having. But I picked the white and the pink, and these are from West Yorkshire Spinners. It's actually cerise, I believe, is the colour it's given. A medium British-sized yarn company. And they were purchased from my local independent yarn shop here in Glasgow. Local yarn shops often function as offline spaces where knowledge and community is formed around a shared interest. Wool and yarn generally is a very tactile object, and the internet is not always the best place in which to experience the object, which makes a local yarn shop a really important place. The multicoloured one in the middle, however, in these shades of pink, purple, blue, and yellow, was hand-dyed in Bridgeton in Glasgow, just around the corner from the Women's Library. And I purchased it at Glasgow's annual yarn fair, Glasgow School of Yarn. Indie dyers are usually one-person businesses who create yarn for knitters and crocheters. Like the dyers of the past, actually, a lot of their work is often overlooked and not treated as a creative process in its own right. Rather, it's often considered as part of the final product. I think if you talk to indie dyers, they will tell you a very different story. It is in its own right a creative process. They often sell their work online, but also in local yarn shops and at yarn fairs. So these three spaces and these three types of business are overwhelmingly run by women, and they interact together and promote each other and complement each other's businesses. Their customers are also overwhelmingly women too. And I'd argue that these women, they're not engaged in the anti-capitalist crafting of the 70s that I talked about earlier. But what they but what they are doing is they're engaging in a form of intentional consumption. These are the products they are choosing to use for their craft, and these are the places in which they're choosing to access it. Like I said, for my jumper, I got to knit it how I wanted. As I mentioned before, there's a huge shift in techniques because of the internet. The biggest and most relevant change, I think, is knitters and designers who conceptualize a knitted garment as a 3D object, who utilize that and then push that medium further. So I knitted the pattern, I adapted it so it was knitted as a singular piece in the round. That's the real reason. It has nothing to do with how much I hate sewing seams on knitting, I swear. But additionally, I used a modern cast-off that was originally published in the online magazine Knitty in 2009. And I also tweaked the pattern slightly, rather than adhering slavishly to the pattern as written. To make it fit my body better across the shoulders. I am much bigger in the bust than I am wide in the shoulders. So in order to stop it reaching all the way down to my elbow, and like this outfit does, I had to stop it a lot higher, and therefore need to shape the shoulder a little. With the jumper, I kept it as close as possible to the original. Yeah.
Sorry to jump in. I'm just and making sure we have time for questions. I don't want to cut you short, but just
goodness,
to say
you're right. This has gone
we've got 15
slightly
minutes
longer
left,
than I was anticipating.
And I'm sure people will have questions. So perhaps should we wrap up in 5 minutes if that's manageable?
Yes. All right. I will run through this a bit quicker then.
Thank you, Becky.
No, that's quite all right. I hadn't seen the time. Yes, so I did it for my own enjoyment and benefit. So the other big change was the Venus band. As we're running on time, I'm not going to go too into this, but I wanted to change it to reflect my feminist politics, which are intersectional. So instead of just doing a band of Venuses, I designed a few new symbols, and on the left, you've got the originals. On the right, there's the few changes. So we've got the combined lesbian symbol, the Mercury symbol, which has been used as both non-binary and intersex, a non-binary symbol, a modern one, and the trans symbol. And I wasn't replacing the Venuses. There's still 25 of them on the jumper. I just augmented them with a greater understanding. So here they are in the finished ones. Did have to do a few sewing ins afterwards for that. But I really like this because this jumper then, it's by and about me. It connects my body, my politics, and my gender into this one jumper, if you know how to read them. So obviously I was going to talk a little bit about the blog posts, but these were really important in just, sharing it. It could have been a couple of pictures for the socials. That would have been great. I'm here today because Lucy read the blog post and was like, we'd love to hear you talk about this in your process. So if you'd like to read more about some of the context and go into a little bit more of it, I would encourage you to go and have a little read. The last thing I want to talk about is volunteering, and to understand why this worked as a volunteer project. So I dived a little into the literature of volunteering, and about 20 years ago, there's a shift in understanding of the role of volunteer in museum and heritage. The old model is that volunteers are free labour used to plug a gap in underfunded museum workforces. Volunteering is not a form of unpaid work experience. Rather, it is a leisure activity which involves gaining access to museums and heritage attractions, their staff's expertise and their collections at a level that is often denied the casual visitor. Volunteers then are not free labour, they are the ultimate visitor who get backstage access to staff collections. The critique, of course, is that volunteers go beyond just consuming in museums and become active producers in their own experiences and the experience of other visitors. So volunteers are both an audience and a resource. In producing the jumpers and blog post, Glasgow Women's Library became, as Noreen Orr puts it, a creative space where volunteers are active in appropriating their own heritage and contextualizing the museum within their own lives. And frankly, if that doesn't sum up this project, I don't know what does. My advice for anybody interested in facilitating this kind of project within their own institution, I cannot stress the importance of good management. That can be financial, so making sure that materials, transport costs are covered, simple things like that. But as a leisure activity, you've got to have realistic expectations of what your volunteers are going to do. One Australian studies found that volunteers generally give about between 1 and 5 hours a week. So you can't expect rapid turnarounds. This project took me a whole year. I did take a break over the summer because, frankly, nobody really wants to read about knitting in a July heatwave. But because I had the freedom and the flexibility to do that within the museum, and I was trusted to manage my own work that way, I did it at my own pace. I got to dig deeper into the sources, and I think I produced something better because of it. And having a community of staff and volunteers around me at the Women's Library who, even if they weren't knitters, were enthusiastic about my nerdy special interest project, made me feel like my work was important. And last thing I'd say is that an enhanced learning experience is more than just training and new skills. It's also the freedom to follow your own interests. And I followed it all the way here today. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry I went a little longer than I was anticipating. The QR code here goes to all the sources I've used, if you want to go and have a little read of those and a little explore of those. And I also have that link in my socials as well. So thank you very much, Lucy, and the National Archives for inviting me here today. And thank you to all the staff at Glasgow Women's Library who were so enthusiastic in supporting me in doing this.
Thank you so much, Becky, for sharing this project. I've really, really enjoyed the talk today, and I can see from the chat how much other people have got out of it too, and how much it's prompted people to talk about their own creative activities too. So thank you. In the time that we have remaining, we have lots of questions in the Q&A. So I will see how many we can get through.
Alrighty.
So somebody has asked, I'm very interested in the term para-academic, which was a term used at the beginning. Could you please say a little bit more about this and what this means for your own research practice?
Yeah, so this is a term I got from Dr. Adele Patrick, who's one of the founders of Glasgow Women's Library. And it's a term that she uses, and there are a lot of people in the field of textiles who are independent researchers. There isn't a lot of funding, there aren't a lot of job roles, so there's a lot of us just doing this on our own time for free. But I think that means that it can be quite easy to dismiss that somehow our work isn't as valuable as traditional academics at times. So para, as in parallel, this work is parallel to the work of other academics. We're just doing it away from traditional academic institutions. I mean, I read a whole bunch of papers for this. I like the research I've done is no different to a lot of the research that a traditional academic would do. So this is why I use the term para-academic as alongside.
Thank you. I think this is probably a quick question or a not quick question, depending on your answer. If you were able to volunteer anywhere else in the world, where would it be?
Ooh. That's a really hard one. Only because I was chatting to a bunch of people this weekend at the conference who work there. Either FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology, or the Met's costume collection in New York, because they are the pinnacle of the field, and there's so much you could find in there.
Thank you. I'm sure lots of people here would love to go behind the scenes in the Met costume collection. Somebody has said, have you heard of Lydia Morrow's work? We can pass this link on to you. Somebody who's also Glasgow based.
Very likely I have, and I'm terrible with names, so
I'll make sure
yes,
you get
please
that link
pass the link along. I love having other people's links passed to me. It's the best thing.
Yeah, thank you for your contribution there, Lucy. Somebody has said, you mentioned the intentional consumption of modern knitters as opposed to the anti-capitalism of the 70s. How do we think this is being skewed by the overconsumption that's encouraged online, particularly with younger generations on TikTok?
So, without going too much into how making things changes your relationship to clothes, because it very, very much does. What you tend to find with this is that a lot of knitters. So there are two types of knitters generally. There are those who are interested in the outcome, the product, and there are those that are interested in the process. Now, everyone sort of sits somewhere on that. For those that are very interested in the process, quite a lot of the time, the choice of yarn is integral to how they're doing that because of how it makes the experience. So, you know, if you just want a nice, cheap finished jumper, you might just go and buy a nice, cheap finished, cheap yarn. But at the same time, if this is your hobby and you're going to reknit the same thing 3 times on with the same yarn, you might want to pay for that bit more for something that you're going to enjoy working with. Honestly, the whole production, consumption within knitting still is an entire conversation. Frankly, we could be here till dinner time talking about that. For me, the intentional consumption is I'm going to buy something to work with and make something nice. I'm willing to spend that little bit more on a quality product that I know is going to make a quality garment at the end of it.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree. I think we could be here all day talking about that relationship. Somebody's asked a really interesting question about the different spaces or the different spheres that you've brought together here. So the spheres of the knitting shop, Glasgow Women's Library, and Spare Rib, which are all spheres that are particularly inhabited by women. And they've asked, can you talk about the similarities and differences between these spaces?
Absolutely. I mean, what's really interesting is certainly within yarn shops, certainly within the women's library, it's that these are spaces in which women interact. And actually you see that in Spare Rib as well. They have, in a pre-digital age, for a lot of feminists, that was where they interacted with each other. They would write into the columns, they would write things for it. They would, like, you look at the letter pages in Spare Rib, that's where the interactions are happening between feminists. Whereas the women's library, that's a physical space that allows us to have those interactions. And at the same time, then the yarn shop is an offline space where this happens. So next month is actually the annual yarn fair. And that's going to be a really interesting thing to go to, because I'm suddenly going to get to see a whole bunch of people that I know of and have interacted with online and talk to them in this offline space about the topic of knitting. So I think this is very much this thing of spaces where women interact and where our interests interact and where they're not diminished. And I think that's a really important thing. One of the things I hear a lot in yarn spaces, especially at yarn fairs, is women going, spent so much money, spent so much. And it's like, well, have you? Or have you spent just enough to make yourself happy? Like, do men get this hung up about their own hobbies? And there's spaces where women are allowed to express their desires, their interests, and pursue them. And that's true across all 3, Spare Rib, the women's library, and knitting spaces. Women are allowed to explore things that interest them in those spaces.
I think that's a really nice note for us to end on, Becky. I'm sorry we don't have time for all of the questions that people have had, and I know there's been really great exchanges in the chat too. But I think to end on thinking about,
if anyone wants to send me any questions on social media, feel free to. The links are down there. So
great, thank you, Becky. Yes, I've really enjoyed hearing today about this story of your own creative practice and your incredible work as a volunteer with this collection. And I'd like to thank our audience too for joining us for this session, the first in our methodologies programme. If anyone is interested in knowing more about collections related to the history of knitting held at the National Archives, we have put together a resource which will be emailed to everyone following this event. We also have 3 more events as part of the methodology series over the coming weeks that might be of interest to you. Next Tuesday, on the 24th of September, we'll be joined by historian Corinne Fowler for a session titled Walking Through Countryside's Forgotten Colonial Histories, in which Fowler will discuss her long-standing interest in the entanglement between rural landscapes and colonialism, walking as a methodology to piece together hidden histories, and the importance of this difficult process of rediscovery to deepen our relationship to the countryside. On Tuesday, the 1st of October, we'll hear from Sarah Ellis, Director of Digital Development at the Royal Shakespeare Company, who will share how digital research can inform creativity and how the Royal Shakespeare Company, the first performing arts organisation to be granted independent research organisation status, is exploring the relationships between performance and emerging technologies. We're also excited to announce a last-minute additional session to the series titled Following the Thread, Creative Responses to the Archive with Michelle Rodriguez. On Tuesday, the 15th of October, you can join artist Michelle Rodriguez and colleagues from the National Archives in conversation to explore how Michelle's practice as an artist and integrative arts counsellor has drawn her to the archive and its gaps, absences, and traces of trauma. The panel will reflect on their experiences running the innovative and engaging Golden Thread Weekend at the National Archives earlier this year. You can find out more and register to attend via our website. The link for the whole methodologies programme is in the chat, and we'll be sharing more about the Following the Thread session over the coming days. We'd really appreciate it if you take 5 to 10 minutes to complete our post-event survey, which will also be emailed to you soon. And finally, thanks for joining us and for all of your questions. And thank you most of all to Becky for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Becky.